The armor that fails. Tony Stark had built his entire life around control. Control over his company, his inventions, his legacy, and most importantly, control over his own mortality. Ever since he had built his first Iron Man suit, it had become his armor not only in battle but in life. He believed that as long as he had the suit, nothing could touch him. No bullet, no missile, no disease, not even death. But what if that control was nothing more than an illusion? For years, Tony had upgraded his suits, making each iteration more powerful, more resilient. Every battle he survived, every enemy he defeated, reinforced his belief that he could master anything, conquer any threat. But deep down, there was always a nagging fear, an itch at the back of his mind, that one day the suit would fail. One day, there would be a threat he couldn't outsmart, a foe he couldn't defeat. One night, as he worked alone in his lab, Tony stood over his latest suit, the most advanced version he had ever created. The lights flickered dimly, casting strange shadows over the cold metal surface. He was tired, more tired than he had been in years. The sleepless nights, the constant battles, they were beginning to take their toll. He leaned against the workbench, staring at the suit as a heavy sense of unease settled over him. For the first time in his life, Tony felt vulnerable. "What's wrong with you, Stark?" he muttered to himself, rubbing his temples. "You've been through worse than this." But the feeling didn't go away. It clung to him like a shadow, a creeping dread that he couldn't shake. As he turned to leave the lab, the lights flickered again, and a soft, almost imperceptible hum filled the room. Tony froze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked around, but there was nothing, no one, just the hum, growing louder, more insistent. "Jarvis?" Tony called out, his voice steady despite the growing unease. There was no response. "Jarvis, run a diagnostic." Still, nothing. Then, from the darkness of the lab, a voice whispered, low, cold, and distant. "Tony?" Tony's heart raced. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the shadows and the suit standing silently on its platform. "Tony, you think you're in control?" Tony's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but this was different. This wasn't an enemy he could fight, wasn't something he could outthink or outmaneuver. In the days that followed, Tony couldn't escape the voice. It was everywhere, in the lab, in his home, even in his dreams. No matter how hard he tried to focus on work, to bury himself in his inventions, the voice was always there, whispering in the back of his mind. "You think the suit can protect you, Tony? You think you can escape what's coming?" At first, Tony tried to ignore it. He threw himself into his work, upgrading the suit, adding new features, new weapons, anything to make it stronger. But no matter how advanced the suit became, the voice only grew louder, more insistent. "You're not in control, Tony. You never were." Tony's hands trembled as he worked, his focus slipping with each passing day. He hadn't slept in days, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything except work on the suit. He told himself that if he could just make it perfect, if he could just add one more feature, he could silence the voice. He could prove it wrong. But the voice wasn't going away. One night, as Tony sat alone in his lab, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking, the voice returned, louder than ever before. You think you can fix this, Tony? You think the suit can save you? Tony slammed his fists against the workbench, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I built this. I control this." The shadows in the room seemed to close in around him, suffocating, oppressive. "You control nothing, Tony. The suit won't save you. It will fail. And when it does, you'll be powerless." Tony's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He looked at the suit, his masterpiece, his creation, and for the first time, he doubted it. He doubted himself. As the weeks dragged on, Tony became more and more consumed by the fear that the suit would fail. He stopped leaving the house, stopped talking to anyone. His entire world became the lab, the suit, and the voice. No matter what he did, no matter how much he upgraded the suit, the fear remained. It gnawed at him, tearing away at his confidence, his sense of control. "You're going to die, Tony," the voice whispered one night as he sat alone in the dark. "And the suit won't stop it." Tony closed his eyes, his hands trembling. "I don't need the suit," he whispered, his voice hollow. The voice laughed, cold and cruel. "Yes, you do. You've always needed it." The final confrontation came on a stormy night. The rain pounded against the windows of the lab as Tony stood in front of the suit, his hands shaking, his breath ragged. He had done everything he could, upgraded every system, reinforced every piece of armor, but it wasn't enough. The fear, the doubt, it was still there, stronger than ever. "You can't escape it, Tony," the voice whispered, surrounding him, suffocating him. "The suit will fail. You will fail." Tony clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "I'm not afraid of you," he said through gritted teeth. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting and writhing like living creatures, closing in around him. "You should be." Tony's heart raced as the shadows engulfed him, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. He tried to move, to fight, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped, powerless. And in that moment, he realized the terrible truth. The suit had never been about protection. It had never been about control. It had been a crutch, something to hide behind, something to distract him from the one thing he had always feared most, his own mortality. As the shadows consumed him, Tony Stark, the man who had built his life around control, finally understood that some things could never be controlled. Some battles could never be won.